Welcome to Busboys and Poets Virtual. Thank you for joining us with authors Jenny Williamson and Genn McMenemy in celebration of their game-changing, attention-worthy book, Women of Myth. Women of Myth is an inspiring book with 50 fascinating stories of powerful female figures from mythologies around the world. My personal favorite from the book is Arawello. For those of you who have already bought the book, please look her up when you get the chance. She's amazing. If you haven't bought the book, that's okay. There's still time to purchase it during the program, or you can find it at a Busboys near you. Now to introduce the stars of the evening. Jenny Williamson is a poet, writer, storyteller, freelance copywriter, and co-creator of the Ancient History Fangirl podcast. She has always been obsessed with ancient history and mythology and of both blends her love of both with her passion for writing and storytelling, making the stories she tells accessible for modern readers. She has published poetry in multiple journals, online and in print, and has a chapbook out with Finishing Line Press. She lives in Brooklyn with her cat, Heloise, and usually one or two foster kittens. Now we have Genn McMenemy, who has been in love with mythology since before she could read. She and her brothers used to listen to their mother read myths and fairy tales and dream about what life was like a long time ago. She has used her nerdy knowledge of mythology and ancient history to co-create the Ancient History Fangirl podcast. Now she is a full-time award-winning freelance marketer, writer, researcher, and copywriter. Originally from the US, she now lives in the UK with her husband Glenn and their tiny dog Tris. She spends all of her free time traveling, visiting historical sites, and researching her next writing projects. Woman of Myth is her first book. And if you are interested in tuning into their podcast, they go live, they broadcast it on Thursdays and sometimes on Tuesdays to give their viewers a little surprise. So without further ado, I will bring in our speakers. All right, take it away, Jenny and Genn.
Hey, thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you to Busboys and Poets for having us. This is so great.
Yeah, this is absolutely amazing. I still can't believe it's happening. It's just fantastic. And thank you to everyone who's listening, who's tuned in. We are so excited to be here.
Yeah, so let's start off with a reading. I will go first, and the one that I picked to do is the glorious Arawello. Legendary Somali queen who smashed the patriarchy. Arawello is a legendary Somali queen who defied traditional gender roles and overturned the patriarchy in her realm, installing women in positions of societal power and assigning men to the roles of home life and child rearing. Arawello is a popular folk heroine in Somali culture, but it's unclear when or if she really existed. However, the legend says that she grew up in a strongly patriarchal, feudal society and that she witnessed many injustices against women before she became queen herself. She also grew up watching the men around her start wars with no concern for the death toll. When she became queen, she appointed women to positions of power in her own government as part of a strategy for ensuring a peaceful reign. Some versions of her story state that she actively oppressed men and encouraged others to do the same, training women to lash out aggressively against the men and their families and ordering the castration of any men who disobeyed her laws. These legends may have arisen after Arawello's death to demonize female leaders and justify reinstatement of patriarchal control. Today, Arawello is a popular name for Somali girls. It's also sometimes used as a nickname for confident girls and women with leadership qualities. What's her story? Arawello was born into a royal family without sons. As the eldest of 3 daughters, she was next in line for the throne. Arawello demonstrated leadership qualities and a penchant for utterly ignoring traditional gender roles long before she became queen. During a period of profound drought, she assembled a team of women to hunt and gather water to keep their town supplied and prevent a mass migration. These were traditionally men's activities, but Arawello ignored any naysayers who insisted she couldn't hunt and find water as a woman. She and her friends just kept out hunting the guys and proving the haters wrong. Eventually, Arawello's father died, and she inherited the throne. She also got married. Her husband tried to get Arawello to embrace her expected duties as a woman, pressuring her to focus on raising kids and tending the home and urging her to leave the hard work of ruling the country to him. Arawello refused. She didn't believe women should restrict themselves to child rearing and the home, even though that was what everyone expected. In defiance of her husband, Arruelo put out a call for all women in her kingdom to essentially go on strike, to abandon all childcare and homemaking and start taking power outside the home. Eventually, men were forced to take a larger role in child rearing and domestic duties because the women in Arruelo's kingdom rejected these roles. But Arruelo didn't stop there. She embarked on a project to transform her country into an entirely matriarchal one, where women were the primary breadwinners and leaders outside the home. A keen observer of human nature, Arruelo noticed that men were usually the instigators in war. Men started wars, men continued wars, and men made wars worse. She believed women were much more level-headed, were better rulers, and were more effective diplomats. Thus, she fired all her generals, diplomats, and politicians who were men and appointed women in positions of power. Arruelo implemented other reforms too, such as making sure girls in her kingdom got the same education as boys. Sometimes Arruelo is depicted as not just being committed to gender equality, but as actively oppressing men. In one version of her story, she trained women to inflict violence on the men in their lives and even ordered the widespread castration of men in her kingdom so that they wouldn't reproduce. Other legends say that she used to hang rapists by their testicles. Another version of the myth states that Arruelo didn't commit targeted violence against men, but that she allowed these rumors to spread so that men would think twice about disobeying her laws, specifically laws about violent aggression and instigating wars. This was one way she maintained peace in her realm. It's not clear how Queen Arruelo died. One story says she was murdered by a grandson who wanted to reinstate patriarchal control over women. Another says that she was assassinated while attending the funeral of a friend. It's not clear when she lived, how she died, or even whether she existed at all. However, Arruelo's legend lives on in the strong Somali women who bear her name.
Right. I'm going to give you guys a little teaser of something a little different than our badass Arruelo, who both Jenny and I just love to bits. I'm going to talk about another queen. Sometimes she's a villain. Sometimes she's a monster. She's our girl, Lilith, the bad girl of the ancient Jewish lore. I swear I can read. I do have a podcast. So, Lilith is a demoness from Jewish and ancient Mesopotamian lore. She appears in the ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian, Greek, Jewish, and Christian sources. She's even in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Lilith is sometimes referred to as Lamia in Latin. This version of her name appears in both Latin and English versions of the Bible. The oldest depictions of Lilith are fragmentary and disputed. Ancient Mesopotamian cultures appear to have had a class of female demons called Liliths, associated loosely with serpents, owls, and evil or diseased winds. Lilith also appears in a variety of Jewish texts, including the Talmud, Kabbalistic writings, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. She's mentioned in one line of the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah 34:14. Her name was translated into Lamia in the Vulgate Latin version of the Bible in the 5th century AD, and later carried over to English translations of the Bible. In ancient Rome, people inscribed her name on ritual bowls and buried them beneath thresholds to keep out malicious spirits. They also wore amulets inscribed with her name, intended to stop her from doing evil to the wearer. But what's her actual story? That's what we think we know. Perhaps the most comprehensive myth about Lilith comes from the Alphabet of Ben Sira, a satirical work in Hebrew. Its author is a mystery, and its dating is controversial. It may date from the 700s to the 1000s AD. It is not a religious text. In fact, it would probably have been seen as very edgy in its time. Its content includes references to masturbation, farting, incest, and heretical religious topics. Aren't you glad I read this one? It's here that Lilith is described as Adam's first wife. In the story, shortly after God created Adam from the earth, he created a woman to be his companion, not from his rib, but from the earth in the same way Adam had been made. The name of Adam's companion was Lilith. And as soon as God created her, she and Adam began to fight. The issue, as it is with so many couples, was sex. Adam was seriously vanilla. He only wanted to do it in missionary, and he wanted to be on top all the time. But Lilith refused to lie below Adam. They were equals after all. They had both been created from the same earth. Adam declared that she was supposed to be on the bottom because she was the inferior one. God clearly intended him to be the superior. That, as you can imagine, did not go over well. Lilith dumped Adam and left the Garden of Eden, flying to a cave far away. Adam prayed to God, complaining that Lilith had refused to submit to him. God sent 3 angels to go and retrieve her and promised Adam that if Lilith didn't return, he would kill 100 of her children every day. The angels flew off in pursuit of Lilith. They found her in a sea cave overlooking the wild waters of the Red Sea, where she was busy copulating with demons and having demon babies, as one does. Presumably, the demons let her be on top. The angels told her that it was God's will that she go back to Adam, but Lilith refused to consign herself to an eternal wasteland of boring missionary sex. She adamantly refused to return. The angels threatened to drown her in the sea. They threatened to kill 100 of her demon babies every day. Lilith shrugged and said she would kill human babies in equal numbers, taking dominion over the first 8 days of every baby boy's life and the first 20 days of each baby girl's. The angels continued to threaten and harangue Lilith, and Lilith continued to dig her heels in. Finally, they agreed to let her stay and negotiate a deal in which they would leave her alone and she would not kill any babies wearing a protective amulet inscribed with one of the angels' names. According to some versions of the tale, Lilith later attempted to return to the Garden of Eden, only to find that Adam had a new partner, Eve. In revenge, Lilith snuck into the garden while Adam was sleeping and had sex with him while he slept, stealing the seed and later giving birth to a host of demons. In this way, she populated a demon army and became a demon queen.
In the pictures.
Yeah, she's real naughty.
This is Aruello. Our illustrator was Sarah Richard. And my camera's a little weird there. And she did such an excellent job.
This is Lilith. I absolutely love this gorgeous, gorgeous stacked cupcake. She is just incredible and evil.
Stunning.
And so much fun.
Yes.
So,
should we get on to the discussion?
yeah. So, Jenny, what made you excited to write this book, our Women of Myth book? What did you want to make different about this book compared to other books about mythology?
Well, I don't know how different or not different my vision was about this book as opposed to other books, but what made me really excited about this project, and this was a project of 50 women and femme characters from world mythology from all over the world, and what I was really excited to do was focus on diversity, obviously diversity of cultures and time periods and, you know, different countries and things like that, but also I think diversity of what it means to be a woman. You know, like we really looked for figures that were really sort of diverse in terms of their personalities, in terms of what kind of powers they had. Like we have women warriors and goddesses of war in there. We have goddesses of love who have a lot of sexual agency and fertility. And we have, you know, women in the heroine section who are warriors, who are healers, who are mothers, who are both sacrificing and not self-sacrificing. We have rulers like Aruello. We have characters that come from a more humble background. The monsters are really fun in that way too. And I think that another thing that I was really excited about was showing gender diversity within the category of women. Like we have trans feminine characters. We have women who present, you know, in a more like non-feminine fashion, and just like being really inclusive in a lot of ways, like across a lot of lines. You know, that was what was really exciting to me.
Yeah, we had a little problem in this process while we were doing the research. This is where I always jump in. There's this one word that seems to pop up every time you talk about women, and it's a huge thing that part of what they wanted in the book when we were pitching it and writing it was a description. And there's one word that shows up every single time when you see a female heroine, and sometimes when you see a monster, and almost always a goddess. It's the word beautiful. And I have never hated a word as a description more than the word beautiful.
So many of the characters we cover were beautiful, and we couldn't just get rid of it because a lot of the time the story would hinge around the beauty of this character.
Yeah. And as you can see between Jenny and I, we are very different people size-wise. So I was super excited about this project because of the diversity of cultures and stories and people we were going to be able to feature in the book. What I wasn't so thrilled, particularly with an illustrated book, was using this descriptor beauty around women and seeing depictions of women all sort of adhering to the Western beauty style. So when we were talking about this book, one of the biggest things after, the diversity of what it means to be female was the body diversity. That was super important to me. And I have to say, our artist, Sarah Richard, just knocked it out of the park. There are women who are very slender. There are women who are, who are trans feminine, and there are women who are stacked cupcakes, who are larger, and they are all stunningly beautiful. Even the monsters are stunningly beautiful. And I just felt really strongly, as someone, who goes through life with a larger body, I don't want to put a book out using the word beauty to describe women and not show beauty at all sizes across all people. And so that is one of the things I was super proud about with this book, is how well that has been achieved.
Yeah, definitely. Body diversity was really important.
Yeah, it's not just body diversity of larger, it's athletic women. It's every woman gets to look different and be a woman however they look. And I really like
it. Yeah. So Jen, I have a question for you, and I have to, of course, my iPod chooses to die every time. So what was your research process like, and what was your priority just in terms of how you were doing your research?
My research process, so both Jenny and I feel comfortable saying this for her, we were anxious to approach this project because we wanted to make sure that telling these stories, we were able to find as many sources as possible that came from the culture that we were talking about. We really didn't want to be, we both were very aware of our gaze. We're Western women, and we wanted to tell stories of people from around the world. So our research process would start with, okay, you find the most accepted source, and then you dig down and see, can I find this story from an own voices or a cultural or someone in that culture? And if I can, how do they differ? And how can I tell this story so that it feels true to from what I can see in English? Because again, sometimes you do struggle with the fact that not everything will be translated in English widely. So with what we had, we were like, how can we find the sources? How can we then make sure that we're digging into the sources that give us a perspective from that culture that the story comes from, and not just, a Western culture that is repeating something. So we really tried our best to do our due diligence in that, and that was super important to us. And, that was, I think, the thing I was most anxious about, but also excited about, because there's so many amazing people, women who we feature, and it was just an absolute pleasure getting to do this research.
Yeah, I agree. I think that this was something that Jen and I have a podcast, and we have done a lot of work. I think the podcast really taught us how to do this, because we have been covering different cultures in the podcast and learning about, like how the story differs depending on the vantage point and, who wrote things down, because a lot of the times we would be dealing with ancient cultures where one group might have written things down, the other groups didn't. So we had to sort of triangulate maybe the story from the other group's point of view, based on archaeology, based on accounts from cultures around them that did write things down, based on, what people are digging out of the ground and artistic renditions and all kinds of other things. So we had experience doing that. Neither of us are professional historians. But I think we just really thrived on that work and really loved it, and kind of felt like we were ready to take this on after doing the podcast for about as long as it would probably take for a PhD, maybe.
Yeah, 4 years live and about 2 years before we'd even gone live and with the podcast. So yeah.
Right.
What was I going to say? So Jenny, what were you most anxious about and most worried about getting right in this book?
It's a really good question. I think that what I was the most anxious about was covering characters, cultures, areas of the world that I had not covered in the podcast before. There are some characters in the book that we had covered in the podcast. And when I got to do one of those, I was always like, yay, I've already done this research. So I had done that, but the ones that were new to me, I just really wanted to make sure that I was getting it right. And I think cultures that had experienced Western colonization, I felt like a really extra responsibility to make sure that I was not applying my own Western lens on anything and try to sidestep all of that and be very aware of how these stories were told in different contexts so that I was really getting it right. And that people from the culture would appreciate it. So those were the things that I was very mindful about when I was writing this book. I mean, I wouldn't say I was super anxious. I was excited and anxious, like they kind of go hand in hand. But that was kind of what I was trying to be the most careful with,
Yeah, I mean, I had kind of the opposite reaction. I was super nervous about getting little known or women and figures in mythology who are lesser known in Western mythology, but are much more widely known in their own mythologies in other areas of the world. I was less worried about getting their stories right because I felt like I can do the work, I can find it, I'm bringing this to a wider audience. Like this is super exciting and less anxious for me. But what I was super anxious about is for some reason I took some of the more well-known ones, including Mulan, who like everyone knows the story of Mulan. I was really stressed about doing justice to the story of some people, of some of these women who everyone knows their story, and making sure that I did their stories justice, I did their cultures justice, and I was able to bring something fresh to it as well that didn't involve a Western lens, in my retelling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Sorry, my iPad. So Genn, who's a lesser known woman of myth that you learned about and that you were particularly excited to write about, that you didn't know about coming in?
Okay, so this one I didn't even know about in the research. When Jenny and I went through, we made this epic long list of so many women. We couldn't include them all. And one of them Jenny found, and her name is Aisha Khandesha. And she is in the monster section. She is incredible. She may or may not be based on a real life countess who is part of the resistance against the Portuguese in Morocco. But essentially the mythology around her, and she still has like urban legends. You still see her in I think there's some French films about her, but and she's still very much in urban legends today in Morocco. But the story of her is she is a footed seductress who finds men and lures them to the water, and when they get there she devours them. And the actual story is there may have been a countess who essentially lured men, high-ranking men out.
Portuguese men, I think, right? Because they were like
the men who were part of the invasion in Morocco. She lured them out, and when they got out where she was, she would have the men behind her who were part of the resistance kill them and take all their information and anything else they wanted. I'm like, that is amazing.
Yeah. She was like, I think it was like lured them to a beach or a body of water, and I believe, if I'm remembering right, that her mythological version is tied to bodies of water in that way. So it's interesting what details have come through.
Exactly. And again, we don't know if she existed or didn't exist, but what I love about her as a character and as a mythological figure and as a monster is that she is so tied and rooted into the history of a place and the folklore of a place. And it's something that a lot of times we don't hear or know about.
Yeah.
So, Jenny, I was going to say, can you answer that question as well?
Oh, yeah, I can. So I would say that one that I did not know about, that in my experience is less well known, maybe just less well known to me, but I was so excited to talk about this one, was an Aztec warrior goddess called Itzpapalot. So she is so cool because she is an Aztec warrior goddess with butterfly wings lined with obsidian knives. And when I read about her, Genn and I were putting together the proposal for this book, and we were just kind of looking for characters and, different people we might want to include in the book. And this one, I think, was one of the first ones that I found that I was just like, oh my gosh, have you ever heard of this figure? You know, so there's this incredible myth about her that has to do with her chasing this hunter down. Like, she's originally a deer, and this hunter is chasing her through the forest, and then she transforms and she's hunting him. And eventually she, you know, gets into his hut and has sex with his friend and then eats his heart. And it's pretty great. And we do not code the details in this book. You can tell there was a lot of castration in the Arowello entry.
I mean, a lot of sex in Lilith. You can see what you're getting, right, in this book. It's gonna be
this is pretty much what you're gonna get. So yeah, so I really love that one.
So Jenny, which character, you know, who's your favorite, or who do you most identify with, or left the biggest imprint on you while you were doing the research?
I would say a lot of them did. You know, I really felt when I was writing the ones that I was Genn and I split this up half and half. So we each took 25 entries, and the ones that I wrote, I've always felt really connected to when I was writing them. One that has really stayed with me is this Yoruba warrior goddess named Oya. I was always very attracted to the warrior goddesses. This one stands out. And Oya is just, she's Yoruba, she's the West African from an area that kind of includes Benin and Nigeria and a sort of broad swath of that region. And she's also important in some African diaspora religions today. And she is really cool because she's a goddess of storms and wind, and she's a warrior, and she's also a goddess of commerce and like death, and she's associated with cemeteries, but she's also associated with like business, and she's very charming. So she has a lot of different facets. And the thing that I really love about her is that her name means, I think it means the terror, and like Tearer. And she's a goddess of change, like big violent change. So it's like this sort of like transformative change that comes before a period of renewal. And I always felt connected to that because I know like this is something I've seen my female friends go through. It's certainly something I have dealt with many times in my past where, and you know, maybe even my present, you know, where you just hang on to something so long, whether that's a relationship, whether that's a job, whether that's like a bad situation, whatever it is, you know, just hanging on longer than you have to, hoping that it'll change. When what you need is some real badass Oya energy to sweep in there like a wind and just tear everything out because she's the terror and let you start again, you know? And I just found that so empowering. And I think about her often whenever I feel like I'm in a situation where it's like, well, should I stay or go? Should I put up with this? You know, like Oya does not put up with anything. No, she's the best.
She's the terror.
So yeah, I feel like I love her.
So
what about you, Genn?
I'm going to be super basic. My love of mythology, it's no shock on the podcast. It's, you know, anyone who knows me, it came from Greek mythology. And the one person I really fought to include in this book more than any other was Atalanta. And that's because there is a version of me who took a very long time to learn to read, who, you know, when she finally was able to read on her own, read this book. And the only female hero in it who wasn't someone there for a side quest for a hero to marry or abandon on an island was Atalanta. And she was, to me, everything I wanted to see at that time growing up as sort of 90s kids. Like, this is the beginning of girls getting to be sword fighters and be equals and have all the stuff that now we get to see all the time. So she was the beginning of that for me. She had agency. She had power over her life. She wasn't going to bow to any dude. And when she did finally marry, it was someone who was, well, he cheated, but he was sort of an equal, but he cheated, but he had to cheat because he loved her so much.
I mean, he didn't cheat on her. He cheated in their foot race.
He cheated in a foot race to marry her. He had to go to Aphrodite and be like, Aphrodite, I need help. Like, look at this girl. Look at the dead bodies in the wake of her not marrying any guy. I'm so in love. Please help me. And Aphrodite did.
As she should, you know.
As she should. You know?
And a little problematic, but anyway.
But anyway, I mean, Atalanta was an Argonaut. She was a hero, and I just found a lot of me in her and a lot of the stuff I wanted to do at the time. And even going forward, I just think like, well, what it, her name means of equal weight or as good as the next person, particularly men. And I found that really something that's always stuck with me. So whenever I kind of go into different things, I'm like, well, what would Atalanta do?
For me, it's like, what would Oya do?
I mean, Oya's the other side of the coin, right?
Yeah.
Neither of them takes nonsense.
We've got some audience questions. Should we just take turns reading these off?
Yeah, you go first.
Which character left the biggest imprint on you both? I think we just answered that one. Are there myths or characters either in the book or were considered but didn't make it in that you want to revisit either on the podcast or via another avenue?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah.
So many. I mean, it was quite prescriptive, certain people we had to include. And then really disappointing when we didn't have the space to include others. I think there are so many women who, we didn't get to talk about. We didn't get to talk about Frau Holly, who is this, may or may not have been like a really ancient alpine goddess where people may have been worshiping to her at a mountain filled with bones. Like, she is so fascinating.
There's a whole child human sacrifice angle of Frau Holly that you guys, we actually did an episode about her on the podcast.
Yeah. I mean, there's Persephone and Ariadne. Persephone just is rife to be talked about all the time because she gets to be all the things. And also, I don't know, I feel so much with Persephone. I mean, Ariadne, there are so many other mythologies that I'm totally blanking on now that I've been asked this question. Jenny?
Yeah, actually, there's one in particular that I always kind of kick myself that I did not learn about until after I wrote this book, and it's called the Menanangal. It's this monster from the Philippines. The Menanangal just blows my mind. And we did talk about this on the podcast. We had some guests come on and share some of their mythology with us. And this one came up several times actually. And she's a monster that looks like a normal woman, but her top half and lower half her top half detaches from her lower half and is like a flying torso with just innards hanging out and dangling around. And she has wings, and she's kind of vampiric, but also she eats fetuses, and she's terrifying. And I think there are some horror movies out there that feature her that I have not watched yet, but absolutely should. And she's one that I would just love to delve deeper into the history of and into the reception of, because I just find this figure to be just absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, there's loads of Mexican folklore that I wish we could have covered more of. We've got La Llorona in here, which is great, but there are so many other figures that we just couldn't get them all in. Hopefully one day we'll get to cover them in a different way.
There may be a part 2. Are there any Slavic figures in the book? I
mean, Baba Yaga?
Baba Yaga's in there, yeah.
Baba Yaga. We also talk about the story of Baga and the young princess.
I think it's Vasilisa. I might be pronouncing that wrong.
So yeah, for some reason I'm seeing a Y in it. I'm a little dyslexic, so sometimes I struggle with those pronunciations. But Baba Yaga's in it. There are so many others we would have included, but we kind of, again, it's world mythology. We can only include so much.
Yeah. Have you noticed any trends or recurring themes in what these myths can tell us about the anxieties their cultures may have had about female power and agency?
That's a good question.
I mean, that's something we talk about a lot.
Anytime a woman has sexual agency, like, that's the end of the world. You can see that.
That's quite scary.
It's so scary. Women with sexual agency is so destabilizing, and you see it across a lot of mythologies.
So many different mythologies, women who choose who to have sex with. I think women choosing who to have sex with, as opposed to marrying who they're told to marry, or whatever. I think that's a scary prospect to many people. And it turns up in different unexpected ways, because one of the things that Genn and I we just had a conversation with academic on our podcast about this, where my mind was blown having this conversation. There were lots of different characters. Not Aisha Khandesha is one, but there were quite a few others that we covered, especially in the monster category, where
dear woman, I know what you're gonna say.
Female figures with a bottom half that is like an animal, like a donkey or a camel or something like that. And that we were just talking about how, from a male perspective, it betrays a fear and confusion over what is under those skirts and what women's bodies are like. And it's kind of like an othering thing, potentially can be. Not saying that is always the case, just that is a thing that might be the case. So yeah, like I think, you know, an anxiety about women's agency and anxiety about women's sexuality, both physically and in terms of things women are and are not allowed to do. I think that's definitely a trend, you know, but there were also ones that were, not as like misogynist as that. Like, for example, there's a monster called the Kalupalik, who is basically, she's an Inuit monster that snatches children away and pulls them under the ocean when they go out too far on the ice. And that's a real warning about the environment, you know, like this is like a story told to children to keep them from going too far out onto the ice in a you know, Arctic environment. So it makes sense that there would be a story like that.
And just going back to our Slavic wonder Baba Yaga, what I loved about the research for her was sometimes she's an old woman, sometimes she's three women, sometimes she's beautiful, sometimes she is very much not. But one of the interesting—
Not in our book.
Not in our book.
Maybe she is. I don't know.
I think that there is a way in which you can age into the beauty of that Baba Yaga illustration. But
damn straight, Jen.
What I was going to say that ties back to the Kalupalik is, I think I got that right, is that Baba Yaga also is very much tied to her landscape. So she has this incredible house with chicken legs that can kind of like move around the forest. And when I was doing the research, because I covered her, there were houses that kind of looked like they were on chicken legs. And there was a reason for this, because the cultures where Baba Yaga stories came from in different areas would have to go out for a very long time sometimes and forage and hunt. So what they did was they had these houses that were super high up with a trap door. So you couldn't get into them from the bottom. You had to kind of climb up and down this trap door. And they were able to be left alone while people were out sort of hunting and foraging and being in other places. And, you know, I really love this idea of, you know, some of these scary things we see in stories come from the environment and how the environment impacts the culture and how the culture then becomes part of the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, is that it for the questions? It looks like that was the last one. Unless more, anyone else like to ask us a question?
Yeah.
Now we're all here.
I guess that's it.
Yeah, you guys did amazing. Thank you for joining us this evening. Everyone, please say goodbye to our authors for now. A nice round of applause, virtual round of applause.
Thank you.
Thanks for—
And thank you all for joining Busboys and Poet Virtual. Please check out the rest of our events and be sure to tune in to Genn and Jenny's podcast, Ancient History Fangirl, on Thursdays on all listening platforms. Goodbye.